There's some more seats down in the front here if you can't find one in the back. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. Glad everybody made it out in the rain on a Friday morning. We have a great turnout, and it's so nice to see so many students come out this morning. And I think you're in for a really interesting talk this morning. I am Kathy Vogelsang. I am the president of the Seidman College of Business Alumni Association. And it is my honor to be able to introduce our speaker this morning. But before I do that, I just have one announcement. We had a breakfast scheduled for November 10th with Rick DeVos to talk about Art Prize. That has been postponed, so it will not be on November 10th. Stay tuned for any further dates. You'll see you get it either on an email or a card in the mail. And so our next breakfast will be the economic and real estate forecast that we do every January, and that is held at DeVos Place. And you should be getting information on that shortly. So look for that also. So with that, we can move on with our program. This morning's talk, I think, touches just about every one of us, and so it certainly is of great interest whether you are an investor or in the business world, or even a student. It just touches all of us. This past year has been called the Great Recession of 2008-2009. It's been a very difficult time for many, whether you're someone who, either you or someone you know has lost a job or their home, or maybe you've seen your retirement savings cut in half. The U.S. government has implemented massive stimulus spending to help the economy recover in the short term. But what has been the impact of the government spending in the short term, and what are the long-term consequences? We're honored to have with us today Professor Bradley Schiller from the University of Nevada in Reno to give us his perspective. Few economists offer the breadth of historical, political, and theoretical perspective on the Great Recession as Dr. Schiller. In 2008, Dr. Schiller retired from American University School of Public Affairs in Washington, D.C., and is now teaching at the University of Nevada, focusing on their Principles of Economics curriculum. Dr. Schiller has over 4 decades of experience teaching introductory economics at the University of Nevada, American University, the University of California, and the University of Maryland. Since receiving his PhD in economics from Harvard University, Dr. Schiller has not only taught economics, but has written, lectured, and consulted on a broad range of public policy issues, including significant experience in our nation's capital. He has worked as a consultant on economic policy since the Nixon administration, working in the halls of Congress, the White House, and corporate boardrooms. His assessments of the economy and policy have appeared often in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Washington Times, and other media outlets. Dr. Schiller's studies of inequality, discrimination, tax reform, pensions, welfare, and Social Security have appeared in both professional journals and popular media. Dr. Schiller is also the author of 3 popular college textbooks, The Economy Today, Essentials of Economics, and The Economics of Poverty and Discrimination, that have been used by over 1 million students around the world. And his textbooks are used here at Grand Valley. So for you students out there, we literally have the man that wrote the books on economics here with us today. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Bradley Schiller.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming out on this cold, rainy morning. We almost didn't make it. A couple exits back, the rental car blew a tire in a Michigan pothole. But I was determined to get here to share the good news with you that the recession is over. According to the release of the Commerce Department yesterday, the U.S. economy is growing again. GDP in the third quarter grew by 3.5%. Now, I can see on some of your expressions a certain skepticism about the recession ending. And I also looked at a public opinion poll just 2 days ago, and Americans are very skeptical about the economic recovery. Only 31% of the public believes that we are in an economic recovery. And that's remarkable, not only because it's so inconsistent with the data released by the government, But also in the context of other surveys, one of my favorite was a Fox survey, which asked Americans, do you believe that life exists on other planets? And 48% of the American people believe in extraterrestrial life. And so I come to the conclusion that more people believe in extraterrestrial life than believe in the economic recovery. I find that a little bit disturbing anyway. So what I want to do this morning is talk about the state of the economy, how we got into the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, how and why we're getting out of the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and importantly, about a very hot issue, why does this recovery seem to be a jobless recovery? All right? So let me start, if I may, with the origins of the Great Recession of 2008 and 9. And I don't think there's any ambiguity about what caused the recession. We have to go back to the housing bubble. And all I can add to this is a little perspective on the dimensions of this housing bubble and how it's affected the economy. And the good old days, as we'll remember them for a long time, housing prices were increasing every single year. You know, from 1999 to the summer of 2006, home prices were rising rapidly. And, 67% of the U.S. households own their homes. The equity in the home is the principal source of wealth, if not the only asset for most families. And so during this period, they felt that their wealth was increasing. And how much did it increase in the decade preceding 2006? By $6.5 trillion. So as the median value of the home almost doubled, that increased the equity and the wealth of American families by $6.5 trillion. And this clearly affected consumer behavior. When we feel richer, we go out and spend more money. It's what economists call the wealth effect. And so, according to the Congressional Budget Office, the wealth effect added another $200+ billion to consumer spending every year. For those of you who are homeowners and been through this experience, you know what happened. The value of your home goes up. You discover you can take out a home equity loan and buy a new car or plasma TV or take a bigger vacation. You feel you can afford it because you're richer. And so people got home equity loans, expanded home equity loans, refinanced their homes. So throughout those years, the early 2000s, people are treating their homes as ATM machines, confident that they'll be able to pay them back as the value of their homes increased. And during this period, of course, the savings rate among consumers went actually negative. In 2006 and 2007, the average American family was spending $1,001 out of every $1,000 of income they brought in. And so we were spending every dime we got and a few dimes in addition. And why were we doing it? Because we were so confident that our wealth was increasing and we'd be able to afford to pay off the credit card debt that we were accumulating and pay off the home equity loans that we were accumulating. Well, of course, the party didn't go on forever. As everybody knows now, in the summer of 2006, July of 2006, is the first time that home prices really abruptly stopped rising. Now, although that was the end of the housing bubble, few people recognized it at the time. If you think back to the summer of 2006, or even go back and look at newspaper stories about the housing market at that time, people regarded the stagnation of housing prices in the summer of 2006 as an aberration. It was just a temporary departure from the long-term trajectory of ever-rising home prices. So people didn't change their behavior immediately when home prices sort of stagnated. And you can see from the graph that in the months after July of 2006, home prices were still bouncing around. So you get a couple of little downturns, but then they go up again, and so on. And that process continued for a good 6 or 7 months. So you don't have a serious decline until you get into 2007, and then, of course, the much sharper decline in 2008. So what this means is homeowners did not accept the notion that the housing bubble was bursting. People were still speculating on home prices. People were still managing their money in the expectation that they would be able to pay off home equity loans and refinance mortgages with ever-rising home values. But that turned out not to be the case, of course, and when home prices plummeted, and you can see the sharp decline, people were with mortgages and home equity lines that they could no longer afford to pay, in many cases exceeded the value, the depreciated value of their homes. And so it took months of price decline before the lights really went out for the consumer, and consumers began to curtail their borrowing and their spending. Not to the point where they actually saved a significant amount of money, but at least curtailed the growth of consumer spending. And in that process, of course, the finance companies, the banks, the mortgage companies, and other financial institutions ended up holding mortgages that were sharply depreciated in value. And that's what became known as the toxic assets of the financial system, mortgages that had a nominal value much larger than their market value. And as the recognition of this widespread holding of toxic assets increased, then you have in September of 2008 the seizure of the credit markets, when people in the financial markets domestically and globally looked at the banking system and saying they don't have assets to support the loan activity they're engaged in, and the credit market seized up. So clearly the origins of the recession go back to the housing bubble, the bursting of that bubble in 2006, and then the delayed response to it in both the goods and services markets as well as in the credit markets. And so September of 2008 is when the economy really seizes up. So the next question is, how bad is the subsequent recession in the United States? And if you go back to the presidential campaign of 2008, candidate Obama was pretty explicit that he thought that the American economy was on the brink of another Great Depression. He said that over and over again, that if we continued the policies of the Bush administration, if we continued to play the game by the same old rules, that the economy would fall off the cliff and end up in the abyss of another Great Depression, rivaling that of the 1930s. That was never the case. It was never the case that the economy was on the brink of such a Great Depression. And I think it's important to remember that as bad as this recession is, that this is the 12th recession we've had since World War II. Recessions in the economy are not an exception. We have at least one every decade. And as we look back at the recessions we have had since the World War II, many of them have been longer and deeper in terms of output loss than the current recession. Even on the unemployment rate now is just right around 10%. In the 1981-1982 recession, we peaked at 10.8%. And it's not a question of quibbling over decimal points, but the reality is that this is just another in a recurring pattern of recessions that is not remarkably more stressful than the other 12 recessions we've had since World War II. And you can't possibly put the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009 into the same sentence or even the same paragraph with the Great Depression of the 1930s. In the Great Depression of the 1930s, the unemployment rate jumped to 11.5% the first year, 15+% the second year, and 24% in the third year. You look at the auto industry, which is a very cyclically sensitive industry, very important to this area. Yeah, auto sales are down 40+%. During the Great Depression, they were down 90% in the first year. Look at the stock market in the 1930s. It fell by 90%, not 50%. So a completely different order of magnitude for the downturn that we call the Great Depression of the 1930s, which lasted 10 years, and the recession of 2008, 2009, which will be shorter than the average post-war recession that we've had. And so clearly, historically, it was disingenuous to compare the Great Recession of 2008, 2009 to the Great Depression of the 1930s. There were huge political advantages, however. The political advantages is, first of all, it gathered more votes for candidate Obama, and then once he was elected, it created a tremendous pressure for Congress to approve the package of fiscal initiatives that the president wanted to undertake. And not unimportantly, it lowered the performance bar for rating the current administration. If, as the president's economic advisors have said repeatedly, if we would have been in a Great Depression absent the president's stimulus package, then the absence of a Great Depression becomes a mark of success. And his chief economic advisor, Larry Summers, has said exactly that in his public announcements, that we have been successful because we avoided another Great Depression. But if we were never really on the brink of that, then we need to impose a higher performance standard on the administration's policies. All right. So, despite the fact that we were never on the brink of another Great Depression, I am certain that all economists, regardless of their political stripes, will agree on one thing, that the government needed to intervene. Even the most conservative economists recognize that in times of recession, the government has to take some action to get the economy moving again. So there's no fundamental argument in economics about whether to intervene. The only question is how large the intervention should be and what the content of that intervention should be. And as you are aware, we have had massive government intervention since President Obama, well, actually before President Obama took over. And let me look at the two major forms of intervention. First, on the monetary side, the banking system side, and then on the fiscal side, the budget and tax policies of the new administration. So let me start with the monetary intervention. And to do that, let me hark back to the aftermath of 9/11. Right, back to the terrorist attacks of 9/11. When those terrorist attacks occurred, there was great concern about the American economy. Was it going to hurt the American economy? And in reality, the physical damage to the American economy was trivial. I mean, the dozen buildings that were destroyed in New York, the airplanes, of course, the tragic loss of close to 3,000 lives, that was all a setback. But was the physical attack itself a threat to the American economy? Absolutely not. Back in 2001, when we were producing around $12 trillion worth of output per year, an attack that destroyed billions of dollars in infrastructure was trivial. It's just not even a dent in the size of the American economy. So what was the threat to the American economy in the wake of 9/11? It wasn't a physical threat, it was a financial threat. And to understand that, you have to recognize that U.S. financial institutions hold 70% of the world's savings. Right? Imagine you're a Russian industrialist who's made a fortune as a result of the privatization of enterprises in Russia. What are you going to do with that fortune? Are you going to put it in a Russian bank and take your chances on the value of the ruble and the policies of the administration of the government? Or are you going to park your profits in U.S. government bonds? If you're a Japanese industrialist and you've got a large pot of savings, do you want to buy Japanese bonds that pay close to 0% interest? Or do you want to buy American bonds that pay 3 to 4% interest and have never been defaulted on? It's the same thing around the world. And the world, for decades, has decided that the best place, the most secure place with a high real rate of return is to invest in the United States. So let's go back to 9/11. People around the world are watching television, seeing the same horrific video that we're seeing here. They're seeing financial firms and institutions in the heart of the financial center of New York City being destroyed. And so the threat to the American economy was an international panic that they can't hold their money and their assets in U.S. financial institutions. And so the threat was that foreigners would undertake a massive withdrawal of their money and collapse the financial system. The Fed saved the day. The Fed flooded the financial markets with liquidity immediately after the attacks, reassuring the rest of the world. And it's the rest of the world, because remember, Americans aren't saving any money at all. You don't have to worry about your bank account if you're not saving any money. But foreigners had lots of assets in our financial institutions. And so the Fed absolutely flooded the financial institutions with liquidity and averted what could have been a financial panic. Right? The same thing happened in this last September, when it became evident to investors around the world that credit markets in the United States were seizing up, and the banks and the other financial institutions holding mortgages really didn't have the funds to cover all of their obligations. The Fed again flooded those institutions with liquidity to reassure really foreign investors that their investments in the United States in dollar-denominated assets were secure, which is why the Fed was buying treasury bonds, mortgage-backed bonds, and every other kind of piece of paper that existed. So if there's any single hero in the recovery story, it is unambiguously the Fed, which kept the seizure of the banking system from spreading into a financial panic and a withdrawal of foreign monies. And so we managed to get past the September credit crisis, and then of course, as credit was still very difficult to obtain, spending slowed down, investment spending slowed down, consumer spending slowed down. Let me just look at the actual track record on the different components of total output. You know, there are the four major components of total spending and total output are consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So just quickly a look at what happened to consumer spending over these years. You can see this really starts right before the housing bubble burst in the summer of 2006. And what you've got here is the growth rate of consumer spending on every year. And you can see consumers didn't stop spending money in 2006 or even most of 2007, but the growth rate of their spending slowed. It was still positive growth. People were still spending more money every year, every quarter, after the housing prices stagnated, but they weren't increasing their spending as much. You don't really have a negative turn down in consumer spending until the third and fourth quarters of 2008. And you can see consumer spending then recovered quite quickly in the first quarter of 2009. So what shows you is that as we look at the causes of the recession and realize that the problem began with the bursting of the housing price bubble, consumers were still pretty resilient. I mean, we refused to stop spending money, even when credit gets tight. We find ways to spend more money, and this is unique to the American economy. I mean, the American economy is the most consumer-driven economy in the world. You know, everyone looks to China now. They say, oh, China's doing such wonderful things. In China, less than 50% of total output is accounted for by consumer goods. It's mostly in investment goods and exports. Here in the United States, in 2007, 71% of our output was in consumer goods. So it's a consumer-driven economy. you go back to the years 2000 to 2007, why was the U.S. economy growing so smartly? Because consumers were increasing their spending every single year. The investment situation is completely different. All the popular focus on the consumer is misplaced, and you recognize that when you look at this graph, which shows what's happened to investment spending in this country on a quarterly basis. I had to change the axes here. Notice that, I mean, if I was going to do this in a linear way, I'd have to go all the way down to the floor of this auditorium. But I mean, this is one of the remarkable quarters I have ever seen in history, where in one quarter, investment spending fell by 56%. I mean, that is the total collapse of investment spending. Now, in the first downturn, it's mostly the contraction of residential construction, which is considered part of investment. Once housing prices stagnated, home builders slowed down new construction and ultimately stopped construction for all intensive purposes. And then there was a slight pickup because people thought, well, it's only a temporary aberration, and then residential construction collapses, and after that, all fixed investment collapses, not just residential, but non-residential office buildings and other investments as well. And so it's the investment collapse more than any other sector that brings down the economy. Government spending was fairly consistent throughout this period. Government spending on goods and services primarily comes from state and local governments as well as the federal government. And what you see here is that despite all the talk about cutbacks in state and local spending, government spending continued to grow throughout this period. The only exception is the first quarter of 2009, and that has nothing to do with a downturn in state and local spending. Ironically, it's due to a decline in defense spending by the federal government. For some reason, national defense spending in the first quarter of this year fell by 6%. In the second quarter of this year, defense spending increased by 14%, which accounts for that V. And so if you take out that one-time decline in national defense spending, then government spending on output stays pretty constant throughout the period. So if you put all those together, the message is pretty clear. Here I've just put all the components together. The purple line shows the downturn of the economy in 2008 and 2009. And you can see what dragged the economy down is clearly investment. And again, notice the broken axis here. That red line should be way below all the other lines. So it's lack of investment more than downturns in any other form of spending that have hurt the economy. Okay? So anyway, so there's the dimensions of our problem. We see the monetary intervention that kept the economy from having a deeper and more prolonged recession. Let me now turn to the fiscal side of the ledger, which are the actions on increasing government spending or cutting taxes. And as we all know, there was a massive fiscal stimulus program initiated by President Obama, passed by the Congress in February, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, totaling $787 billion, so a massive fiscal intervention into the economy. And again, there would be no argument in professional economic circles about whether or not that helped. It unquestionably helped. The more important question is, was that the best package we possibly could have put together? And why hasn't it had more impact on the unemployment rate? This is the primary concern of most Americans right now. Why is the unemployment rate still so high when we've had massive monetary and fiscal interventions into the economy? And I want to offer several reasons for what's called the jobless recovery. The first reason is historical again. Looking back at the other 12 recessions we've had since World War II, this is not a new controversy. Every single recession since World War II has been called a jobless recovery. In every one of those episodes, Washington was criticized for a jobless recovery. Why is it that it's always a jobless recovery? Well, in part, it's simple math. The American population now is just over 300 million. It's still growing. It's growing by 1.1% a year. So there's another 3 million plus Americans every year. The labor force is all the people who are employed or looking for work. It's about half the population, roughly 150 million. But it's not a stagnant 150 million. That also increases. In fact, it increases slightly faster than the population, which means that there's another 1.8 million people looking for jobs every year. So you've got 1.2% increase in the size of the labor force every year. So the output of the economy has to grow by more than the rate of growth in the labor force just to keep the unemployment rate from rising. And that's only part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that we have higher productivity every year. Right? The workers can produce more output, which also means the reverse. You can produce the same amount of output with fewer workers. And so if productivity is advancing by 2% a year, that means you can get by essentially with 2% fewer workers. So if you want to increase the number of jobs, output has to grow by at least 3%. 1% to cover your labor force growth and another 2% for productivity growth. So you can't get a reduction in the unemployment rate until output is growing at least by 3%. And recovery starts slowly. Recoveries start with, you go from a negative 1% growth to a positive 1%, and you hope to accelerate that growth. And so until the economy is growing at the rate of at least 3%, you have no chance of getting a reduction in the unemployment rate. And that's why economists have always referred to the unemployment rate as a lagging indicator. It doesn't move down until the economy is already on a sustained growth path. And it was no different in 1991. It was no different in 87, in 81, 82, in 80, in 74, 75. Every recession has been characterized by rising unemployment during the early stages of the recovery period. And there are micro reasons for this too. Even after the output of the economy starts to grow by 3%, you don't have an immediate increase in employment, much less a reduction in unemployment. I mean, put yourself in the position of, say, an auto parts manufacturer in Michigan, and orders start to come in, right? Do you rush out and rehire the workers that you laid off months earlier? No, that's a very risky strategy because there's a lot of fixed costs in rehiring people, getting back on the payroll and everything. You don't want to do that until you're fairly certain that the order book is going to fill up and stay full for quite a while. What do? If you're getting more orders, what do? You work your existing workforce more. The people who are employed in the auto industry and other cyclically sensitive industries aren't working full time. They're working short hours. And so as the employer sees more orders coming in, they will work the existing workers longer. In fact, even if you get your existing workers up to full time, you still might be better off giving them some overtime work before you recall the workers you laid off earlier. And so at the micro level, at the plant management level, there's also a delay in hiring new workers even as the orders start coming in. And so the number to really watch if you want to predict what's happening in the labor markets is not the unemployment rate, which is inevitably a lagging indicator, but instead hours worked. What's the average hours worked in the auto industry, manufacturing industry, or across the board? Because that's the number that's going to change first as the economy picks up. And it's only as the existing workforce moves towards full employment that you can expect new hires at those establishments. So again, that gives us one more reason why we have to have sustained growth of output over a couple of quarters at least before the unemployment rate begins to come down. The Congressional Budget Office, which has a fairly optimistic view of the GDP growth over the next 18 months, predicts that the unemployment rate will continue to rise until next spring. They're predicting that the unemployment rate will peak next spring at 10.2%. Again, lower than it was in 1982, but higher than it is at the moment. That doesn't mean we won't be creating jobs in the meantime. It just means we won't be creating jobs fast enough to bring the unemployment rate down. Well, let me turn to that, dwell on that last observation for a minute. Why aren't we creating jobs faster? Why isn't the economy growing more quickly? So the ultimate problem with unemployment is we're not getting enough GDP growth. Yes, it's good news that the economy is turning around and we had 3.5% growth in this last quarter. But why didn't we have more growth earlier, given the size of the fiscal package that was initiated back in February? Well, I think the problem here is that the stimulus package pushed by the Obama administration was poorly designed to deliver jobs. And I said this at the time, and I can continue to sing the same song, and let me explain my reasoning. Basically, when you're talking about a fiscal policy package, a stimulus package initiated by the government, you have the central choice. Do you want to boost spending in the economy by having the government spend more money, increasing government spending, or alternatively, do you want to cut taxes and trust that people will spend their tax cuts, and that becomes the boost to aggregate spending? So it's a choice between tax cuts and increased government spending. And candidate Obama, and later President Obama, was quite explicit about that choice. He said tax cuts don't work. He referred, and I quote, to tax cuts as the tired dogma of the past. And so he used that argument to make tax cuts a very minor part of the $787 billion package, and instead emphasize increases in government spending. And he was also explicit that he wanted to focus on long-term investments into the American economy, and so most of that increase in federal spending is on infrastructure projects and energy independence projects. Right? So let me look at all the dimensions of that position. First, on tax cuts. What is the basis for the White House claiming that tax cuts don't work? Well, their argument, and again, the Council of Economic Advisors in the person of Christine Romer and Larry Summers, who's his chief economist, they're very explicit. They say surveys show that people don't spend their tax cuts. Well, the surveys they're referring to is when you go out and you ask people if you're going to get a tax refund, what are you going to do with it? And you know what people say? They say they're going to save it. They say they're going to pay down their credit cards. Well, if surveys like that become the basis for economic policy, we might as well look at New Year's resolutions, right? I mean, don't we say every New Year's, oh, I'm going to exercise more, eat healthier, be kind and loving to my family and friends, right? And the average American maintains their New Year's resolution for 2.5 days, right? The question is not what do people say they're going to do with money we give them, but what do they actually do with money you give them? And we have a classic case just from last year. People forget that in February of 2008, under the Bush administration, Congress passed another piece of legislation called, ironically, the Economic Recovery Act of 2008. So there was concerns because of the depreciating home values that the U.S. economy was, in fact, going to fall into a recession. That was no surprise. I mean, economists are supposed to predict these things, and if you see the home prices coming down, you know that's going to be a restraint on consumer spending. You knew the economy was going to slow down. Congress acted on that in February of 2008 and passed the Economic Recovery Act of 2008, which entailed no increase in government spending, simply tax cuts. And so what did consumers actually do? Did they live up to their promises and save the money and pay down their credit cards? Absolutely not. They went out and spent them. And one of the beautiful things about the 2008 tax cuts, if you remember, is you could go online based on your birthday and you'd know which week you were going to get the $300 to $600 payment. And so people didn't have to wait for the checks to come in. They go out into the mall and they would charge something and say, oh, the check will be here when the credit card gets here, it'll pay it off. Right? And so people, in fact, spent their money. And if you go back, oh, there you are right there, the 2008. See this little uptick in that purple line there in the second quarter of 2008? I defy anyone to come up with an explanation of why GDP jumped in the second quarter of 2008, except for the fact that people were getting rebate checks and spending them. I mean, so the fact is that people do spend every dime they get. Again, American consumers love to go to the malls, love to spend their money. We've been doing it for decades. So if we put more money into consumer hands via tax rebate, they're going to spend it. That's a very certain prediction. And so we shouldn't rely on surveys of people say what they're going to do. We should look at what they actually do. And if we look at that evidence, then we come to the conclusion that tax cuts are an effective form of stimulus. And in fact, the important point is they're a very quick form of stimulus. In the 2008 experience, like I said, people started spending their tax cuts even before they got them. And so you get a very quick uptick in consumer spending and ultimately in the growth rate of GDP. And so the president and his economic team grossly underestimated the efficacy of tax cuts. Now, what was their claim for increases in government spending? You know, the president clearly has long-term priorities in terms of infrastructure development and energy independence. And we can have legitimate arguments about the merits of those investments. But I'm not focused on the merits of those investments for the long-term viability of the U.S. economy. What I'm focused on here today is early job creation. If short-run job creation is the goal, then longer-term investments are less appropriate. Will they deliver jobs in the short run? And so the president's economic team and the president himself repeatedly referred to shovel-ready projects. Shovel-ready projects in infrastructure and energy independence. There is no such thing in federal procurement. The notion of a shovel-ready project is just a total fiction. If you gave $10 billion to the Secretary of Transportation tomorrow to expand on Highway 69 or fix that pothole that I hit on the way here and blew out my tire, you know, it doesn't happen overnight. It can't. It's against the law. If the federal government's got $10 billion to spend on a new transportation project, first of all, it's got to get an engineering design. Then it's got, by law, have an environmental impact statement. Then it's got to start the procurement process, which means soliciting bids, reviewing those bids, going back to the bidders to acquire best and final, ultimately then picking the bidder. It's a process that rarely takes less than a year, by law. It's just the bureaucratic legal process that federal procurements have to go through. So even if you could say, oh, we need to fix that pothole tomorrow, the federal government can't do that by law. So there are no federal shovel-ready infrastructure or energy independence projects. They will take at least a year. Which, now you go back and you look at the $787 billion stimulus package, which is supposed to be the increased spending on infrastructure and energy independence projects, and what do you find? It's not spent. Gee, what a surprise. The Congressional Budget Office just 2 weeks ago said over $400 billion of that $787 billion has not been spent. Of course it hasn't been spent. It'd be impossible to spend it that quickly. The only money that's really been spent, and it's an important component of the package, is the $200 billion in fiscal relief to the states and local governments. There you do have shovel-ready projects in the sense that because of the restraint on state budgets, what's happened is many projects were threatened with suspension. Projects that are ongoing would have had to been suspended until the states could pay for the projects. And so the rhetoric of the administration changed from they're going to create 3 million jobs to they're going to create or save 3 million jobs. The jobs they are saving are the state and local projects that would have been canceled or suspended as a result of the budget crunch at the state level. Those projects have continued with the $200 billion infusion that has come from the federal government to the states. But there's been no significant federal spending on infrastructure, or therefore any federal job creation out of that $787 billion stimulus package. And so that's why I say the Obama package was ill-designed for delivering jobs up front. That's why the economy has not recovered more quickly in response to such a massive fiscal intervention. The reality is that massive fiscal intervention is still in the pipeline. So we could have had more jobs, a lower unemployment rate, had we put more emphasis on tax cuts than on increases in government spending. So where are we now? And what's the outlook for the economy now? Well, the outlook for the economy is very positive at this point, in part because of this poorly designed fiscal package. If $400 billion of that $787 billion has not yet been spent, it will be spent. Yeah, there's two things you can be certain about in economics. Consumers will spend every dime they get, and Congress will spend every dime and more that they have access to. They're not going to cut back on that $400 billion. So that's fiscal stimulus that's in the pipeline. The Congressional Budget Office says that spending will start to hit the economy in 2010. So the first quarter and second quarter and the third quarter in 2010, we'll start to see some of that infrastructure spending take place. So you got $400 billion in the fiscal policy pipeline. So if consumers just maintain their usual spending habits, investment picks up a little bit, then you get that massive increase in government spending down in the next calendar year. The outlook for the economy looks pretty good. And then there's also the monetary stimulus. Remember that the Fed has injected massive funds into the financial system. The ability of the banks to lend money depends on how much they have how much reserves they have, specifically what we call excess reserves. Excess reserves are a measure of what the banks can use to make new loans. And in a normal year, the banking system holds somewhere between $500 million and $2 billion worth of excess reserves. So they always have a little bit of lending capacity. 500 million to 2 billion. As a result of this massive infusion of money into this system, as of Tuesday, I just checked the Treasury reports, banks are sitting on $825 billion of reserves. So we're going from a normal year when we got at most $2 billion worth of excess reserves in the banking system to 820. It's an unfathomable number. The banks have more lending capacity than anyone could ever have imagined. Well, one of my favorite economists was Herb Stein, who was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Nixon. And he had a saying for situations like this. It's, if something can't go on forever, it will stop. And that's clearly the case with respect to the bank reserves. The banks aren't making any money holding on to $825 billion of reserves. Banks make money by making loans. And of course, they're getting pressure now from Congress. Members of Congress are chastising the banking community, say, we gave you all this money, why aren't you making loans? Well, is anybody here from the banking community? Maybe you can answer that question. At the same time that Congress is chastising the banks for not making loans, they're revamping the compensation systems. They are toying with a new regulatory framework, a Consumer Protection Finance Agency, whatever the name of this new agency, that's going to oversee all the other banking regulators, including mortgages and consumer lending. So if you're a banker, and your salary is being chipped away, your bonuses are being chipped away, and you're being whipped on and say, make more loans, you have to be a little hesitant to do so because you don't know what regulations Washington's going to pass next week. What if you make a loan, to Ford Motor Company, and then Congress decides you shouldn't have done it next week? The problem now is we have such regulatory uncertainty that the banks are hesitant to make the loans. It's foolish to think the banks don't want to make the loans. Of course they want to make the loans. They can't make profits unless they lend their money. And they're sitting on these massive, unbelievable reserves, dying to make the loans. So why aren't they doing it? It's not because of corporate greed or selfishness. It's not in their interest to sit on those reserves. It's because the regulatory uncertainty is coming out of this Congress. They simply don't know what they're going to do. And the reality of the congressional interventions is they'll go back and change the letter of the law retroactively. So you don't know if you're going to be punished for loans and investments that you make after the fact, even though they were consistent with regulations at the time. So, as I say, this can't go on forever. I mean, Congress is either going to have to put up or shut up on this regulatory issue regulations that everyone understands and bankers can respond to, or punt and give up the new regulatory initiatives until another time. One of those two things has to happen. When it does, then those excess reserves translate into real loans to consumers, to home builders, and into businesses that want to invest. And that's not occurring now. So if you expect that sooner or later that excess lending power actually trickles into the economy or even floods the economy, that's another push to economic growth. So why am I optimistic for the next 12 to 18 months? Because there's so much fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus in the pipeline, and it will come out. As you look further into the future, things get a little worrisome because if the economy continues to grow nicely, as I expect it will, at an accelerating rate over the next 18 months, as we begin to get back to more normal unemployment rates, the question is, how do we stop the economy from overheating? Which seems like an absurd question to ask in a recessionary period when the unemployment rate is still at 10%. But that's what economists are supposed to do. They're supposed to look at what trends are occurring now to see where we are going. We don't want to wait until we get into an inflationary period before we do anything about inflation. And so this is all that talk about exit strategies. What if the economy grows as smartly as we expect it to do? How do we slow down government spending? How do we turn off the spigot? How do we take some of that lending capacity out of the system before it turns into an inflationary spiral? And financial markets are becoming very concerned about that because neither the Fed, nor the Congress, nor the White House has any exit strategy. In fact, I was just in Washington last week, and I would say, if anything, it's the reverse. There is absolute panic in the Democratic side of the Congress about next year's mid-year elections. You know, the long term for Congress is every 2 years. And so the members of Congress are looking at next year's election, and they're saying, we could lose a lot of seats if the unemployment rate stays high. The Congressional Budget Office is saying it will be around 10% by next year's election. You have a president who promised a significant increase in jobs and a reduction in the unemployment rate in his first 12 months. You know, that's not happening. It's not going to happen. And so the Democratic members of Congress are in a panic about we've got to grow the economy faster. And what they're talking about now is a second stimulus program. You know, let's inject a couple $100 billion more. Let's do everything we can to bring the unemployment rate down before next year's midterm elections. And that's a really scary prospect because you've got so much stimulus in the pipelines already that if we add more, then the threat of an inflationary spiral becomes very real. If you want a single explanation for the well-publicized decline in the dollar, it's because international investors, and remember, they're the ones who hold the money in our banking system, they're looking at down the road, as long-term investors do, and they say, well, American bonds are paying 3.5%, 4%, long-year, 10-year bonds, but there's a very real prospect that inflation is going to erode those returns, and we might even end up with a negative real return on our investments. So people are trying to scramble out of dollar-denominated assets and into other denominated assets. So the decline in the dollar is in large part a reflection of declining confidence in the ability of the American economy to avoid inflation down the road. And so the pressure really is, from an economic perspective, to come up with exit strategies, not more stimulus, even though it sounds like a popular response. Let's put more money in the system and bring down the unemployment rate. There's already enough in there. We just have to be patient, let the economy grow, and the unemployment rate come down. So the good news is, hey, we're out of the recession. We'll see the unemployment rate coming down gradually. And over the next 18 to 24 months, I think the economy will be on an accelerating path. The bad news is after that, things get very worrisome, but hey, who thinks that long? So with that as an overview, I'd be happy to take any questions or reactions you have. Yes?
What impact is this recent $850 billion healthcare plan going to have on the GDP component?
That was the one topic I was hoping we would avoid is healthcare reform. Well, everyone recognizes that there's no free lunch and there's no free healthcare, right? The president wants to expand and improve the healthcare system, which is a noble goal. To pretend that you can do that at zero cost is another fiction. It will cost the money. And whether it's going to add $900 billion or over $1 trillion, it's going to be another increase in government spending that we can ill afford in a recessionary period when we're running deficits of $1.6 trillion and the national debt's at $12 billion. It's an inflationary pressure. So again, whatever your feelings about the long-term value of energy independence projects or infrastructure development or healthcare reform, you have to look at these issues in the context of the viability of the economy. And we don't have that kind of excess capacity right now on the budget side. Yes?
Well, first of all, I want to tell you that I use your textbook.
Oh, bless your heart.
I do want to start with a compliment because I would love to get you in a relaxed atmosphere with a glass of your favorite drink and talk about some of the things that you said here. But if I'm allowed, I'd like to ask sort of three different points. Point number one, you say the recession is over, and yes, I agree because the stimulation factor is still in the market that we are going to see things not as bad as the past. But I'm looking also at foreclosures continue to rise at record rates. In fact, in Michigan, we compete with Nevada for
Right.
foreclosures. Lansing, Grand Rapids, Flint, and Ann Arbor have had double-digit increases. It seems to be horrible, and so the wealth effect is being still tremendously savage. So that's one thing. We've also saw, I haven't seen the third quarter numbers yet. I haven't had a chance to look at the computer, but inventory changes in the second quarter were down by $176 billion, which says the business is not only not investing, they're not planning on producing anything. They're still selling out of inventory. And these are numbers which are very troubling. We've seen huge numbers of jobs offshore. So, and I read one report, I think it's a little extreme, that the structural unemployment rate may be as high as 8%. I think that's a bit extreme, but I think those are numbers which are very troubling. When I take a look at the sort of short number, maybe very much based on cash for clunkers and the new home buyer credit. And I guess the second thing, I'll limit it to two, is I'm a little worried about the banks. Thomas Jefferson reminded us one time that banks, we have more fear from banks than we do from standing armies. And if you
Well
look
put.
at many of the economic downturns, our good friends in the financial markets have been sort of scurrying around doing strange things, and we've sort of been behind them. And we got rid of Glass-Steagall and then the Graham Act. We kind of opened the gates to the barbarians, as far as I'm concerned. To me, it is very troubling that the banks are now up to their old tricks. And, the financial system is basically without finance we die. And I tend to disagree with you. I think if we hadn't done anything in last year, that there would have been a complete meltdown of the financial system and things would have been far, far worse. Maybe not Great Depression, but, we wouldn't have seen 12,000 banks close and the like, but we still would have seen a much worse situation than we had. I don't think the banks have been fixed. I think they need serious re-regulation, which would have to go. And I just like to hear your comments on that.
Okay, let me respond to those. When I say the Great Recession is over, I'm talking in a statistical sense. The economy is no longer shrinking. What does recession mean? It means that the total output of the economy is contracting. We are no longer contracting, we are expanding. It doesn't mean that everyone's income is restored or their housing values are restored or the unemployment rate is back down to 5% where we'd like to see it. No, in fact, I was trying to emphasize that it's a slower process, that we have to wait for the fruits of this expansion to trickle down to the unemployed and the homeowners and everything else. So I didn't mean to suggest we should all go out and pop champagne today because the recession is over, but it's some good news that the process of recovery is underway. And I'm also suggesting that that process of recovery is sustainable because of the unspent fiscal stimulus, all the fiscal and the monetary stimulus that's in the pipeline. So the early side, the rain is slowing down, the sun will come out. Oh, please, today. Anyway, so I didn't mean to suggest that all is rosy at this point. All these other lagging indicators. As far as your comments about the banking system, credit is the engine of growth. Economies cannot grow without a viable financial system and the availability of credit. We saw that threat back in September of last year. And I was giving full credit to the Fed for stepping in and averting what would have been a much bigger financial disaster. But what I was emphasizing is that step by the Fed has nothing to do with the fiscal stimulus packages and everything else. The Fed did save the day. And we can speculate forever if the Fed hadn't acted, which is inconceivable, but if they hadn't acted, how great a calamity we would have had, and who knows? I can't answer that question. But given that they did step in, we were never at risk at that point of a Great Depression. Yeah, in the back.
5-year ARMs are coming due next year. How's that going to affect the housing market?
Well, people over the last few years, they keep saying ARMs are being readjusted, but interest rates have gone down. A lot of homeowners are seeing reductions in their interest rates. I mean, I have got an adjustable mortgage myself, and I've seen it go down from 8% to 2 7/8. I'm going, hey, I love these adjustments. I mean, adjustments work in both directions. And the Fed is holding interest rates so low that there's no reason to think adjustments are going to go upwards. Yes?
Our government debt and projected debt is increasing at exponential rates. At what point do foreign investors say we've had enough?
Well, foreign investors are also already hinting at that. I mean, we're approaching $12 trillion in the national debt. We're running deficits now of $1.6, $1.3 trillion a year. So we're adding over $1 trillion to the debt every year. And there's the problem is there's no viable indicator that either the White House or the Fed is prepared to bring down the deficit. There's no discussion. And, the president every once in a while utters something about he's concerned about the deficit and he's reviewing the budget line by line. You hear that in Washington all the time. I don't know if you've ever seen the budget, but it's bigger than the phone book. It would take a good year to go through it line by line. But anyway, it's good political talk. There's no discussion of how to wind down government spending.
What are the consequences?
Well, the consequences would be a sharp decline in the value of the dollar and higher real interest rates in the United States that would slow down the economy. I mean, that's why all nations try to avoid an inflationary spiral, because it ultimately hurts the economy.
Two comments. One, I come from the banking sector, so
That's the bad guy.
No, but obviously we're seeing a decreased demand for capital expenditures right now and equipment expenditures. It's, the companies that, we're starting to see, if you look back at the Fed minutes, kind of two camps as far as interest rates are concerned. One, wanting to start being a little proactive on that, and then the other just being very cautious. What are your thoughts on that and strong dollar policy?
Oh, okay. Looking at the banks, investment borrowing is still low. You saw the collapse of investment, and businesses are still hesitant to jump in and start building more factories and upgrading their equipment and everything. I think that process is beginning. I mean, just in the last couple of quarters, you've seen a significant change in the rate of decline in investment. So there are clear signs that investment will rebound. But yes, they're not demanding a lot of loans from the banks. On the consumer side, there is still a demand for mortgages, but the banks, as you are aware, are much tighter on their conditions. People have to put down, maybe for expensive homes now, anything over the FHA ceiling, banks are asking 25, even to 30% down payments. Forget the good old days where you put down a couple of percent. So banks are more hesitant to lend money, not only because they're worried about getting repaid, but because of the threat of congressional action and what are the new regulations. So,
With the Fed and interest rates, I mean, what are your thoughts?
oh, well, yeah, the Fed is in a very difficult position. The classic between the rock and the hard place. They want to make sure that they keep rates low enough until they see substantial lending activity, but they don't want to be in a position of fueling another bubble, right? The next bubble is going to be the Treasury bond market. It's pretty clear. In the back.
Do you have an estimate for how high that $12 trillion number could go before really messing things up?
Well, it's hard to give an absolute number because it depends on the viability of the economy. If the economy grew at 4 or 5%, then the $12 trillion shrinks as a percentage of GDP. I don't think it's the absolute number right now that counts, because everyone recognizes that in a recession you're going to have an increase in the budget deficit through your automatic stabilizers and your discretionary stimulus packages. So everyone is forgiving, if you will, about that. The problem with the size of the deficit and the debt right now is no one sees any actions to bring down the deficits in future years. And so that's why the size of the debt is such a huge issue.
And then at some point, does the Federal Reserve start buying the debt up?
Well, that's what they've been doing. It's the Fed buying all the Treasury securities that's keeping interest rates so low. Yes?
What about when Bush's tax cuts expire? What kind of effect will that have on this whole thing?
Well, remember when Obama was running for president, he said one of the first things he was going to do was reverse those tax cuts. Given the recession, that policy was off the table. No one's going to raise taxes during the recession. And they expire at the end of 2010. The president still says he's committed to letting them expire, but the consensus is in Washington is that's not going to happen because it would be it would exacerbate the spending problem. Okay. All right, so I hope I've given you some short-run hope anyway. So,
Well, very
thanks,
good.
Ed.
We'd like to thank you. It's a
Thank you.
pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
I'm supposed to make sure that you get a
Oh,
handy
it's not
dandy,
heavy enough to
gift.
be booze, is it?
Well, maybe that's a certificate.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We'd like to thank you all for being here this morning, and enjoy the rest of your day. Try not to get wet. So.
Watch out for those potholes.